I've been traveling full-time for the past 5 years, and 3 years ago, my wife and I decided to sell everything that we own and get on the road full-time, becoming 100% location independent. So for almost 3 years now, we've been traveling from place to place, city to city, and country to country, perpetually circling the globe so that I can do what I love. Travel photography. So I've been wanting to put together a training series for years. So when the F-Stoppers approached me in Germany and pitched this idea to me, I knew it was the perfect time to do something like this. So I didn't want to create a short tutorial here. I wanted to be able to teach everything I've learned about photography over the last 5 years in the most beautiful locations on the planet. In this tutorial, we'll be visiting both Iceland and New Zealand. And we picked these two countries for a very specific reason. So while it's been winter here in Iceland, it's summertime in the southern hemisphere in New Zealand. Landscape photography isn't just about being in the environment with a camera, it's so much more than that. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you those in-camera settings, but I'm also going to show you how I achieve my signature look in post-processing. So we're on the road for nearly 3 months together producing this tutorial so that we can try to encounter and simulate varied weather environments and conditions. Now, this doesn't always work. Sometimes we fail miserably, the weather just destroys us. Sometimes we come up with amazing images, and sometimes things are not gonna go according to plan. But we're gonna be honest with you guys about it and show you when things work and also when they don't. So this entire project is gonna be a massive undertaking. So let's get things started in Iceland in the middle of winter. In this video, we're gonna travel the entire ring road of Iceland, and that's gonna take us through epic waterfalls, all sorts of changing landscapes from very, very high mountains to flat lowlands. The scenery changes so much here in Iceland. It's so extraordinary to be here. It feels like we're standing on an alien planet sometimes. Enough talk, it's time to have some fun and start photographing the world together. I've traveled to Iceland many times over the years, and it never fails to impress. So we're in Western Iceland on the Snæfellsnes Peninsula. This is Kirkjufell, the mountain, the conical shape you see behind me. This is the waterfall next to it. It's Foss's waterfall in Icelandic, so it'd be Kirkjufellsfoss for the Kirkjufell waterfall, basically. We just got out here. When we looked out the hotel window, it was kind of nice, blue hour and clear, but we have some heavy rain coming in, so we're gonna wait for this rain to clear before we start actually shooting the environment. One thing that I've learned about Iceland is that the weather can be wild and unpredictable. So I'm trying to get the shot as quick as possible before that window closes and I get soaked. All right, that's good, all right. Holy shit. All right, so I actually cannot look at the camera right now. I think we're still recording audio. Oh man, yeah, here comes the hail again. After getting completely destroyed by the weather all day, it's obvious to see that day one was a complete failure, but we weren't going to stop there. So we're here again, day 2 of filming on the Snæfellsnes Peninsula. This is Kirkjufell behind me. We were here yesterday. It was some freezing rain, piercing hail, and some just all-around bad conditions. So one awesome thing that came out of yesterday, aside from getting to spend half a day in a hailstorm, was all that hail and cold weather has left this beautiful dusting of snow in our scene here. So we're able to use that to our advantage and have really nice color separation. We have the whites and the browns to work with here. It's really great. So now I really want to talk about composition. So we have this additional camera here set at 14 millimeter. And I'm gonna walk around and kind of describe what you can get out of some different compositions here. So with a scene like this, it's really important to explore your surroundings, the entire area, before you really settle on a photograph. Now, with something as beautiful as this area, there's really not too many wrong answers. It's really gonna be up to you to frame something that you think is compositionally pleasing. But what I wanna do is take this camera in video mode and kind of show you how the composition can change, even if you just move a few feet or a few meters to the right or the left. In this video mode, keep in mind that I'm shooting 16:9 aspect ratio. Normal camera ratio is 4:3. So we're gonna be seeing a wide aspect here. So it's not gonna be exactly the same aspect you're gonna get when you take a photo, but it's gonna be close enough so we can get the idea. So this composition here is really good if I'm trying to get the entire scene. It's what I like to call an establishing shot. If you were gonna show somebody this area and this mountain, this would be a good way that you'd be able to visually describe the entire area and everything that's going on. So you can see we have all three of these little waterfalls on the left. We have the mountain actually centered in the composition, which looks really nice in the background. And we have the nice leading lines through the frame of the waterfall, the water washing through, down further the lower waterfalls, and out into the water to the right of the frame. This is shot at 14mm. Let's just take a look at what happens if I start to zoom in. This is with the 14-24. So if I really wanted to, I could also do a tighter composition like this and still frame the waterfalls and the mountain. And what that's gonna do is kind of compress what my visual elements are and make the subject sort of locked into just the waterfall and the mountain in the background. And this is actually right around somewhere between 18 and 20mm. It's right around 19, but probably not exact. Could probably even go a little bit further, and let's see what 24mm looks like. So with 24, I can still get a nice composition with the waterfalls and the mountain. But for something up here, this far back, I really like taking advantage of the wide 14mm to frame the entire scene. One other thing that's really nice when you're shooting wide is having some foreground elements or some interest in the foreground that helps draw the eye into the frame. It also creates some really nice separation. So you kind of have a third system going on here where the bottom third is the foreground, the middle of the frame is all of the subject matter, and then you still have the sky in the top third in the background. So you can even change the composition slightly. Let's say we didn't have a very interesting sky, and we could frame more of that foreground or more of that ground, and then you don't really have to focus on the sky so much. In a similar fashion, we could go up just a little bit higher, minimize the foreground, and still get something nice. Really emphasize those clouds or the detail in the sky that we want to capture. So as you can see, this is a really easy shot to get. If you have a wide lens and you stand up here at the top, you can really frame everything, the waterfalls, the mountains, and everything, and get a really nice frame. It's really hard to take a bad picture here since everything's laid out right in front of you. It's easy access, it's pretty self-explanatory, and you don't have too much going on outside of this interest area in the center. So now that we've figured out my favorite vantage point for this scene, now let's explore the rest of the area and see what else we can come up with.
Bear in mind that I don't usually do my scouting with a tripod, but in this case, we needed the video to be very stable.
So all I've really done is moved about 20 feet to the right, and I'm already starting to see some differences in the composition. So further to the left, I had the mountain sort of framed in the center of the composition, and now that I've moved to the right, it makes sense to still frame the waterfalls on the left, but now the mountain starts to move to the right. This is because as you move from side to side, the parallax between your foreground elements and your background elements start to change. I've also gotten a little bit further down on this slope, so the whole scene has started to change just a little bit. Now what's interesting here, before when I could zoom in on the waterfalls and the mountains, if I start to zoom too much here, that's a 24mm, you can see that I'll crop that mountain out. So I can't do as much of a zoom shot here as I could to the left. To the left, I could frame both the waterfalls and the mountain with the zoom. Here, I'm starting to cut it off. So I wouldn't really recommend cropping something like this, especially this mountain. Kirkjafell is sort of a celebrated mountain here in Iceland, and in the photography community, it's become sort of a popular icon to photograph, and you can see it all over Iceland. People really love it. So you're kind of doing it an injustice to crop it. It's kind of better to have the whole thing in the scene. So if you're gonna zoom a little bit, don't zoom that much. So you don't have to shoot at 14mm, but try something in between if you want to kind of compress that, just so you can get the whole mountain in and all the waterfalls. Let's keep moving down to see what we can do. So this is really interesting too. I've now walked down to the second level of the waterfalls. So this is sort of, it's a completely different shot now. So the waterfalls we were really focusing on before are now gone from the frame, and instead I'm focusing on these little waterfalls in the foreground and still the mountain in the background. This feels like a completely different place to me, and it's kind of nice. By exploring the scene, I've actually found something that I'd probably shoot if I had a second day. If I got the shot I really wanted, these are the kind of shots that I'd focus on later to be able to get additional shots that I can use as well. Researching this location, the shot that I picked near the top is what you see the most often because it shows everything in the frame. But you can easily create something completely unique in a location by just exploring the environment and trying different things. So this is an angle of this area that you don't see as often. So it's something that you can make your own and something that you can make more unique. So here's even another composition. As you can see, there are so many beautiful vantage points here just waiting to be discovered. It's really hard to find a wrong answer, no matter what kind of camera you're using, what kind of lens. In this environment, you should be able to find a nice, beautiful composition to work with. So with a composition like this, the reason I have it composed how it is because I have these beautiful leading lines. You can see the water moving in from the left, through to the right, and down the waterfall, and sort of down the nice river to the right. You can also see that the foreground elements are creating a really nice compositional element on the bottom and the right side of my frame. You can also see that the mountain sort of complements that composition and on the bottom. So there's a nice composition on the bottom and the top of the frame, and then we have this nice flow direction of the water moving through it. I also like the mountain right in the center because the mountain shape being a triangle towards the top and the compositional element of the ground being sort of that reverse section, it complements each other. Where I don't start to like the composition is if I move it too far to the right. And then I think I have too much foreground, too much of this ground to the right, and not really enough interest on the mountain and the water itself. In a similar fashion, if I moved it too far to the left, now I'm really focusing on too much of the water to the left and not so much the mountain. But if we move it right around the center, really work with those leading lines, those natural leading lines in the foreground, we can start to create a nice balanced composition and a full frame. With all these angles that we've seen so far, I've been high up above the waterfalls. Now let's see what it looks like if we get close to them, sort of at ground level. So here we are right next to the waterfalls. So obviously mist is going to be a problem. It's only going to take a few minutes before my lens is completely coated with water and I have to wipe it off. But down here, I'm just trying to show you guys an example of what it looks like all the way down here. So with all the other shots, we've been above all this looking down. And now we're right at the water level and we have something completely different, but also very beautiful. Down here, I actually have a little bit more control over the perspective. Instead of working at 14mm, since the mountain itself is a little bit smaller, I can experiment by zooming in a little bit more and changing the framing so that I can focus in a little bit more on the waterfalls and the mountain. So before, the shot before was 14mm, now and I'm about 18mm, and I can even go in just a little bit tighter here. So now instead of something wide, I've zoomed in a little bit and now I'm focusing on the mountain and the waterfalls. So you can see as I zoom in, the composition changes pretty dramatically. Instead of having a sort of a wide scene that doesn't really focus in on those elements, I can zoom and focus in so it tightens the waterfalls and the mountain together. So it kind of brings the scene together and allows me to focus on the most important subjects of the photograph. So if I can only get one shot of this location, I really want it to be an overall establishing shot, meaning that it captures the entire scene. So I really want to focus on having a little bit of the foreground here, which is what I'm standing on, which leads down into the waterfall. I really want to capture those waterfalls on the left. I want the entire mountain in the background, and I also want the mountain to slope down and lead to the other side of the frame. So if you look here behind me, you can see those waterfalls on the left. You can see that I've framed all of the waterfalls, the mountain, and I'm actually getting those mountains to the right. So the mountain behind me, the big mountain, EL-PTWLPAP-L1, actually slopes down and leads the eye into those mountains in the background. Something I like to do with my Nikon cameras, they have a really nice built-in leveling system. Now, with a landscape that slopes where I can't actually see a distinct horizon line, there's no way I can really level the scene accurately, so I rely on this level gauge to not only level the scene, but to tell how much tilt up and down I have. So I know now that I'm actually tilted a few degrees down, and my horizon, even though the landscape is slopey, is actually perfectly level.
Some cameras have better built-in leveling systems than others, and some don't have it at all. If your camera doesn't have one, you can always buy one that attaches to your hot shoe. Or, worst case scenario, you can always adjust it in post later.
So the basics of the settings that I'm using, I'm shooting in aperture priority mode, and I'm using an f-stop of f8. Typically, and especially with this lens, this is the 14-24 for the Nikon, has a max aperture of f2.8, which means that it gets its sharpest starting at around f4 through about f11. If you shoot around f8, you're pretty much guaranteed with your lens that everything's going to be sharp throughout. You can push it a little bit further to f11, which means you'll get a greater depth of field. And anywhere between 8 and 11 is pretty nice. Past 11, you'll start to get the negative effects of the lens, like diffraction and negative vignetting and things like that. So I usually start around f8 unless I have stuff that's really close to the foreground or a reason that I need to turn that up anymore. Since it's in aperture priority mode, I also have the shutter speed being determined by the camera metering, so I'm not really going to worry about that. As far as white balance settings go, since this is a landscape and I do have some nice ambient light, I like to use the auto mode until I need to change it otherwise. The auto mode is really good at picking up what the colors should be and what that Kelvin temperature should be naturally. If it's a little bit dark and it's coming out a little bit wrong or a little bit blue or a little bit warm, I'll change it to a manual setting and I'll change the custom settings. But generally for 99% of these landscapes, since I'm shooting when there's already light, I can leave it on the auto setting and it picks up everything pretty well. And of course, using post-processing and raw processing, we can always change the white balance later. So as long as it's pretty close, we don't have to make any great adjustments in post-processing. Something else I want to talk about here as we're composing the shot is my ISO settings. So right now with this camera, the Nikon D810, I have it set to a very low ISO 64. That's the lowest native setting on this camera. Typically with landscapes, when I'm not too concerned about the shutter speed, it can be pretty much anything I want it to be. I'll turn the ISO down as low as possible. So in this case, it's 64. Many cameras are going to be 100 or 200, and that means that I'll get very little noise in my scene. So the lower that ISO can be, the cleaner and less grainy my image will come out. So that's very important for clean, crisp landscape images. Another thing that happens with a low ISO setting is my shutter speeds are going to be a little bit longer. In this case, it's going to perfectly soften those waterfalls just because they're a little bit longer. If I wanted to freeze time, and that means I wanted everything to be real quick, super fast shutter speed, I'd have to turn that ISO way up, probably in this case to about 1600. The negative aspect of that would mean that I'd get a bunch of grain associated with this image. So since I'm nice, set up, stable tripod setup here, I can shoot with as low of an ISO as I want and get all the positive effects of a clean image. So let's look at an example. I'll do one shot at a low ISO 64, and I'll do another one at 3200, and we can compare the difference. You can see the grain. With the low ISO 64, it's really, really clean. With the high ISO of 3200, it's really, really grainy. So as you can see, at ISO 64, we get very little grain, and since the shutter speeds are slower, we also get nice soft water on the waterfall. At 3200, we get a grainier image. You can see all the grain that's happening in the sky. And as an effect of a faster shutter speed, we're freezing those waterfalls a little bit more in time, so we get a little bit more of the texture and sort of shape of them. So a good takeaway from this regarding the ISO values, if I walked out here and I only had my camera handheld and I was in a dim lit scenario like this, hand holding the camera and getting the shot, I'd have to turn it up to ISO 3200 to be able to get the shot, because my hands are going to shake a little bit and I'm going to have to have a very, very fast shutter speed in order to capture it and have everything be really sharp. So we got in here a little bit early, as I like to do with my scenes. I like to be able to give myself enough time to set up before the lighting event happens, before the sunrise or before the sunset. So let's take a look. Since I was here early enough, let's take a look at what I consider to be too early for the shot. So it would be sort of an early blue hour in this case before the sunrise. We can take a look at a scene that just does not have enough light in it, as opposed to a scene that starts to get enough light in it. So as you guys can see in this shot here, this is the blue hour shot again, there's just not enough light in the scene for me to really use the shot. And again, I got here really early, so I had enough time to set up, but I'm really waiting for the sun to come up a little bit more and more light to be in the scene. You can see the sky looks pretty nice with those nice blue tones, but since the sun hasn't come up enough, the foreground is really dark and does not have a lot of definition because there's not a lot of light on it. So since we're all set up here and the light's not exactly right yet, we're gonna wait and see what happens over time.
The light can change dramatically all day long, so we stayed here set up in the same place from sunrise to sunset in order to capture the best moment of light.
So I think I got everything I need in camera. The rain's starting to come out again, so let's go into Photoshop and put all this together. Hello everyone, welcome to the post-processing studio. I'm here in Charleston at F-Stopper's headquarters. We're now a few months after we've left New Zealand, so a couple months have gone by, lots of editing is happening, lots of prep for this kind of stuff has been going on, and I'm really excited to start sharing and working on some of these files together. Since this is the first time that we're going to sit down together, I just want to explain a few things. The way that I've developed this post-processing course, you'll always have a lesson that will start in the field, and you'll have a companion post-processing lesson that'll go along with it. And we're gonna go step by step. Each lesson will get progressively more difficult, and I'll introduce new tools and techniques. The first thing though, post-processing may seem a little bit intimidating if you're just getting into it, but don't panic. I'm gonna take you through it step by step, and we're gonna be working on the files that we captured in the field together. When most people think about post-processing, they think a lot of complicated things go into the overall process. But if you're familiar with my work, and you can pick your favorite image, no matter how complex it looks, it's solved with 4 easy steps. And the first steps are raw processing and light balancing. Second step is any exposure blending, which we're not going to get into quite yet. It's going to take a few lessons before we introduce that. And then it's going to be contrast and color changes. And I'm going to make little details and texture enhancement. So that's step 3. Step 4 is sharpening and any noise reduction. So that's it. It's an entire 4-step workflow process. I want to point out that this is what I consider to be a workflow that I'm showing you guys. So rather than just teaching you guys the software, I'm going to take you into these files that we captured in the field, and from day one, we're going to learn how to make these photos even better. We've added a companion zip file that you can download. Now that zip file, when you unzip it, it's going to contain a folder that has subfolders for each individual lesson. So depending on the lesson that we're working on, just click on that folder and open the Lightroom catalog. I'm also including all the raw files you need to recreate each photo from each location. And you can do that simply by downloading the companion zip file, unzipping it, and this is what you'll see. You'll see a folder with all of the lessons. And if you expand each one of these folders, you're going to see subfolders. One's going to be the Lightroom catalog that you can load to see all the raw files inside of Lightroom. One's going to be the Photoshop files of anything that we work on. I'm going to create a PSD here that you can reference and see all the steps that we took to create the final image. Lastly, if you want to import these raw files into your own catalog, I've also kept them inside their own folder just for raw files. Something to bear in mind also is that these pictures do not belong to you. We're giving you these shots so that you can work for educational purposes, but you do not own the rights to them. In fact, we own the copyright, so please don't be that guy who posts them on Facebook as your own photos, to 500 pics, or to Instagram. Also, please don't be that guy that sells these as large format prints or starts doing their own galleries and their own sales. Ultimately, these aren't your photos, and chances are if you do something like that, we're going to find out about it, and let's be honest, that would be a little awkward. We gave you these files so that you can learn along with me and then apply those same skills to your own photos later. Also bear in mind that since my workflow involves Apple computers, anytime I say Option, the PC equivalent is Alt. Anytime I say Command, the PC equivalent is Control. So if I say Command C for copy, if you're on a PC, you can do Control C instead. When you download these files and you move them to a different computer, you may encounter an issue, and that means you may encounter a problem where Lightroom is missing the files when you open the Lightroom catalog. If that happens, follow these easy steps. First thing, go into Lightroom, and inside the project, if you get the missing media error, if there's little question marks in the corners here, just go to the library panel, go to the working drive or whichever drive you're connected to, and all you need to do is right-click on that folder that says Raw Files, and find Update Folder Location. Once you click on Update Folder Location, just point it to wherever you've put these raw files and everything will pop in and you'll be ready to go. I have to admit, I'm really excited. We spent 3 months in the field capturing incredible imagery, and we started in Iceland. So let's get started on the first one. You guys remember Kirkjufell? We had 2 days. The first day was an epic fail with wind and rain, but day 2 we got some really nice results. So what I'm gonna do is go into the folder Lesson 1, Kirkjufell, and I'm gonna open up the Lightroom catalog associated with Lesson 1. If this is the first time you guys have ever opened Lightroom, we're just going to be focusing on a couple of the key windows and panels here. So right now, I want to make sure that you're in the Develop module, and we're going to be specifically looking at how to change the exposure of individual raw files, and that's going to be here on the right. Now, if you opened up the companion file, you'll notice that you have 10 raw files associated with this. You also might remember that when we were in Iceland, I left the camera in one place and I shot for most of the day. Even though the day was short, I probably ended up with 300 raw files and tons of file space associated with that. Rather than giving you all the files that I shot, I'm just going to give you the ones that I'm using to create the final image. That way we can go through it together without cluttering up our hard drives with unneeded space. If you've never used Lightroom before, don't worry about it. We're just going to be going over a few simple things, so let's get started right away. Let's take a look at these raw files. Remember, I was shooting 5 exposure brackets. So in the center of each one of these sets is the neutral exposure. Now this was shot, I'd say late, close to sunset, while this one was shot at the early blue hour. So immediately, I just wanted you guys to see the difference when I say that this is not enough light for the scene. The sun has not risen yet. I'm not getting any light on the mountain. It still looks pretty nice. There's a nice blue sky, some nice tones, soft water. But if I roll over to this exposure, you can see that the sky starts to have nice yellow tones in it. It has a little bit more dynamic elements. And if I start to look at the other exposures, it's a better balance of nice sky and highlights. So again, I had 300 of these files and I just picked the best one. This set of 5 here was the one that I really wanted to focus on and the one that I want to create the final image around. The first thing that I want to cover is the most important thing. It's step 1 in my workflow, and that is raw processing. It's basically how you balance your lights and darks. Some people just call it light balancing. So I shot 5 exposures just so I could leave the camera rolling, shooting 5 exposures when we went around and taught the lesson. You guys remember we went over a lot of different compositional things. So let's take a look at those 5 brackets that I shot. We have one that's very underexposed. We have the one that's exposed, metered for the camera, so what the camera thinks is correct, and then we have one that's overexposed. And this was shot in an auto exposure bracketing, so this is the neutral one. It was set to 5, so we have -2, -1, 0, +1, and +2. So I don't want to do any exposure blending at all. I want to be able to get as much mileage out of a single raw as possible. And in order to do that, we first have to understand how far it is that we can push a single raw file. So here's a general rule. Here's the first general rule that I want to share you guys about processing raw files. You can always pull more out of the shadows than you can in the highlights. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, let's say that we overexposed a file. And how can I say that I've overexposed it? What's the big indicator that I've overexposed it? Well, take a look at the sky. It's blown out. It's completely white. And if I look at the histogram up here, this is a representation of the shadows the midtones, and the highlights. And you can see how the highlights are this huge spike on the right side of the screen. That means the camera failed to capture the highlights associated with the sky. So in Adobe Camera Raw, we're able to try to recover those highlights. Same thing if I would have underexposed something. You can see I have shadows butted up on the left side of the histogram. In Adobe Camera Raw, I can recover those. But the general rule being, I can always recover more out of the shadows than I can in the highlights. So let's try it. Let's go back to the highlights, and I'm going to try to recover the highlights. When I say recover, I just mean moving around these sliders. You can actually change the exposure just as if you would in camera. You can change the contrast, highlight, shadows, whites, and blacks. And if you're not sure which one of these is corresponding to, you can either roll over it here and it highlights it in the histogram, or you can go over the histogram and highlight the sliders. So in this case, let's just say, well, you know, the foreground looks pretty good, but let's pull the highlights down and see what we can get. And in this case, I pull those highlights down and I didn't get much at all. Let's pull the exposure down, and the exposure of the foreground is looking better, but you can see that now I'm getting this ugly platinum gray sky. So it's a little bit impressive that I got this cloud detail back, but I have none of that rich color and detail that I had in the underexposure. So automatically we know that we cannot use this raw file. I'm just going to reset it really quick, and let's do something similar. Let's go to the shadows. Now remember how the highlights turned really dark. What would happen if I brought the exposure up a little bit here and pulled out the shadows? Well, automatically I am ending up with sort of a neutral image. There are some grays in here, but I've very quickly been able to transform this into something a little bit more usable. And I've moved these highlights over to the right, so I'm just going to pull them back and I can actually get that nice sky back. So automatically, if this was my only exposure and I had to use it against this one, this overexposure, I would definitely pick this one. But since I've picked 5 exposure brackets, let's pick the best one to move forward. I'm going to reset this one again. So I have a choice here. You know, right now, even with the camera metered neutral exposure, I still feel like the sky's a little bit blown out. And if I start to pull the highlights down, you can see that it's that same thing. I'm getting some of the detail back, but I have to turn it all the way down to get the sky values back. I don't want to push it that far. So I'm going to step down to the -1 exposure. And this is really nice. Since I've shot 5 exposure brackets, it gives me all the creative flexibility to just roll through them and pick the one that I like the most, the one that I can use. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to first adjust the overall exposure. Now, we can agree that this neutral exposure looks really well exposed in the foreground. This is a -1, so obviously it's going to be a little bit dark. So the first thing I'm going to do is bump the exposure. Now, typically with the D810, you can go about 2 stops, but I'm going to just keep it right around 1, 0.8 to 1, and then I'm going to do a few more things. I'm going to pull the shadows up. So the first thing I'm really concerning myself is with the foreground. So I'm going to get that nice and balanced. Now, you might have noticed by changing the exposure, moving it to about a 0.1 or 0.8 to 1 positive exposure, I've also managed to blow out the sky, which was the whole reason I picked this exposure in the first place. So here's the great thing about working with Adobe Camera Raw as opposed to working just in camera. If I would have shot this under or overexposed, it would clip the shadows or the highlights. Because I'm in Adobe Camera Raw, if I were to clip the highlights by changing the exposure, all of that color data still exists here digitally inside of Lightroom, and I have the ability to roll it back. So just because I've moved it up here with an exposure bump doesn't mean I can't roll it back with the highlights. And it doesn't mean that I can't pull things back a little bit on the exposure just to get the sky the way I want it, and compensate by pulling the blacks up instead, and maybe the shadows a little bit as well. So I've been able to compensate and maintain the beautiful sky that I wanted. So I'm just going to make some fine-tune adjustments here. And again, what I'm doing is just trying to balance the light. So instead of losing the sky here, I went for the other exposure and I was able to get the sky back, but also bring out all the details in the foreground. And again, this is a single raw, and it's a -1 exposure from the 5 exposure brackets. So this is a way that we can do it without relying on HDR or blending multiple exposures. We can do it with a single RAW because they're very powerful these days. At this point, I could take it a little bit further inside of Lightroom, but I'm going to hold back a little bit until future lessons. Now, by changing the highlights, by adjusting this, by correcting the tonal values here, I've also compressed everything down and to look more as if it was just midtones. We notice that we don't have a great amount of contrast here, but that's okay, we can fix that later. We've also got an effect where I've lost a little bit of the color because it's turned a little bit gray here, maybe a little bit flat, less vibrant up here. So the one thing that I like to change before I go into Photoshop, and I won't do this all the time, but with some images, especially when there's a lot of browns, I like to turn the vibrance up just a little bit, and that'll give me some of that saturation back. You'll know when you turn it up too much because it'll start looking just ridiculous. So make sure you turn it up just a little bit. We're just trying to get some of that value back so that we can edit it and push it a little bit farther in Photoshop. And if we roll down here in the Develop panel, you're going to see something called sharpening. Now usually sharp images are great, and you guys know that I work very hard to get my images to be as sharp as possible, but Lightroom sharpening is not very good. In fact, I don't think it's good at all. I try to avoid it. By default it says 25, so I always like to turn that down to 0. On the bottom here, the other thing that I want to do is enable profile corrections and remove that 14mm distortion. When I click on this, you'll see it pop right into a less distortion frame. It's also gotten rid of that vignetting and made it look a little bit more perspectively accurate. The other thing that I want to do is remove chromatic aberrations. 14 to 24 at f8 doesn't really have too many CA problems, but there could be little ones. This is now a one-button process, so just go ahead and click it on your lens. It'll do a very good job. Now that that's done, what I'm going to do is get this into Photoshop. There are a lot of ways to get this into Photoshop, but the way that I want to do it is a little bit different because I'm going to be saving these PSDs. I'm going to right-click on the raw file, I'm going to go to Export, and I'm going to pick the Export options. In the Export options, I'm going to be exporting to, I have a temp folder set up to catch all these files and bring them into Photoshop for me, but my image format is going to be PSD because I'm working in Photoshop, Pro Photo RGB. On my camera, I'm set to shoot Adobe RGB. If you're not sure if you've set this or not, check your camera settings to see. Most cameras that support sRGB also support Adobe RGB. They don't support Pro Photo, but these are color gamuts. Pro Photo is the highest, followed by Adobe RGB, and sRGB is actually the smallest color gamut. It means you have less editing capabilities over the color in your files. So I always like to work as high as possible. Same thing here with the bit depth. Typically, I work at 16, but I'm going to work at 8 just to speed things up. 16 will double the size of your files. Last thing I'm going to do down here under post-processing, which is not really what it's doing, it's a post-action, is to open this in Photoshop so that it automatically opens up the software with the PSD, and I'm going to say export. If you've never opened Photoshop before, don't panic. I promise it's actually much easier than it looks. It's a little bit intimidating at first because there's this empty set of palettes with all these buttons on the left. But what I'm going to do is bypass all the technical stuff and we're going to get right into how to get the most out of these images. So throughout the time we spend together on this post-processing, I'm going to be introducing different tools and different things that you can use in Photoshop. But right now, I just want to show you my favorite method for getting all that color contrast and rich vibrancy back into my images. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go up to Filter and I'm going to apply, under Nik Collection, I'm going to apply Color Effects Pro. Now this is not a standard plugin pack that comes with Photoshop. You actually have to either download the trial or purchase this plugin pack. Now I've been using Nik Collection by Google for years now, and while I used to do so many of these processes manually and very tediously, now they've been combined into really powerful filter sets. So do yourself a favor, if you're not using it, go ahead and download the free 30-day trial. It's an unrestricted trial. There'll be no watermarking. If you like it, you can go ahead and purchase it, but I guarantee after you see a couple of the tools and a couple of things I use in here, you're going to definitely want to pick it up and at least try it. So right off the bat, when I said that we did all that raw processing in Lightroom, I said that we also brought everything back into a mid-tone. So basically, I'm going to go ahead and reset all this so that we can have exactly what we had coming out of Lightroom. Now, inside of Color Effects Pro, there's these buttons up here, and if I click All, these are actually all filters in Color Effects Pro. There are tons of them. You can make things look like old photo paper, different pastels, glow. Later on, we're going to do an Orton effect, really cool things like that. And these aren't just for landscape photographers. They're for graphic designers, they're for portrait photographers, wedding photographers, you name it. There are things here for everybody. Now, I've starred my favorites on the left, and since I've starred them, these are my landscape photography favorites. If I go to favorites there, it condenses that list and gives us something that's a little bit easier to work with. So the first thing that I don't like about adjusting the raw file, even though we get all the tones that we need, it needs more contrast. So I'm going to pick my favorite tool first, called Pro Contrast. Now, you guys may have used brightness and contrast or contrast sliders inside of Lightroom, and you've noticed that if you turn them up too much, your whites get crushed, the blacks get crushed, and everything just looks a little bit too, well, contrasty, given the name. I want to do something a little bit different. I have something called dynamic contrast. And the beauty about dynamic contrast is what it's going to do, it's going to amplify the midtones and the quarter tones, so everything next to the midtones and next to the highlights, and basically not touch the shadows or the highlights. Leave those in place and create a really vibrant image. The other benefit is, I was shooting in Iceland, and it was really soft light because the sun never really comes up that high in the wintertime, so with soft light we get beautiful highlights, but they're subtle. What dynamic contrast is going to do, and I'm going to start turning this up, is it's going to give me exactly what it's called, dynamic contrast, but it's going to leave the highlights and the shadows alone. So if I turn this on and off, here's the original, and then on, you can see that it created more vibrancy, just more tonality to this. And that's dynamic contrast. With all of these things though, they're done to taste. So if you want this to be really impactful, kind of crazy, or a throwback to maybe an HDR look that you like, you can turn this way up. What I like to do is start subtle. So I'll start maybe with 30 or 40% and then work my way up, because I can keep adding more over time rather than overcooking it all at once. The other slider that's here that's really nice is correct contrast. Correct contrast will be more of a traditional contrast, but it will try to maintain your highlights and your shadows. But that's going to fix some of the areas here that are gray. So I'm just going to turn it up just a little bit. We'll leave correct color cast alone for another time. So let me just get these settings just right. And I'm going to add one more filter just by saying add filter. And I'm going to add brilliance and warmth. This is a daylight scene, and the sun's kind of coming in very low from the sky from the left and illuminating the side of the mountain. We have some warm tones in the clouds and lots of warm tones in the foreground. So what I want to do is just amplify that warmth simply by changing the warmth slider. So again, this starts to really come into effect low. 10 to 15% is usually enough. If you turn it up too much, you're going to notice that you're going to tone your image, which is not what we're trying to do. This is just subtlety. This is putting back the warmth that I could have changed the white balance for, but this is, again, a very subtle effect. Now I have a pro contrast and a brilliance and warmth. I'm going to say OK, and it's going to apply those filters and create a new result for me. I should point out that Nik Collection by Google is a great software package, but I'm running this on an older MacBook Pro, so it does take a little bit more time. The faster your computer, the faster the load's going to be. Now that Nik has applied, it's come in on a new layer, and I can toggle it on and off to see the difference. Since it's on a new layer, I can also change the opacity and maybe only use a certain portion of the effect. Say that I maybe think 100 was too much, I can roll this back to 80 or something just to soften it. For now, I'm going to leave it at its 100%. Remember back in Lightroom when I said Lightroom sharpening really wasn't that great? I'm going to show you the easiest technique to get really sharp edges on your image. First thing it's going to require is that we create a duplicate of the layer. So if you've never done that before, just click and drag your layer all the way down to the Create New Layer button, which is this one right here, the new thing that looks like a page. Let go, and it creates a duplicate of that layer. Once that layer is duplicated, go up to Filter, Other, High Pass. A high pass is going to look really funny at first. It works based on a radius, and that radius is based after an edge detection. The first thing it does is it detects all of the edges and then creates a tolerance, highlights and shadows around those edges. So this is an extreme example of 36 pixels, which is way, way too much. For landscape photography and for 36 megapixels like the Nikon D810, 3 usually works pretty good. A heavy effect would be 5. A light effect would be 2. So we'll go medium with 3. I'm going to zoom into this now once it's applied. I'm going to zoom right into the top of Kirkjufell Mountain there, and you can see that I have these edges and I have a highlight and a shadow on the edges. I'm going to have to use a blending mode, and I'm going to use a blending mode called Overlay. What's cool about Overlay is everything that's 50% gray will disappear, and it will only amplify what's left. In this case, anything that's a little bit darker or a little bit lighter will show through. So you can see that it looks like it completely disappeared, but if I toggle it on and off, so here's on and here's off, you can see how dramatic that sharpening is. If I pan around here a little bit, you can actually see in those lakes and that road, you can see all that sort of come to life. Almost like the image was completely dull before, and now it's sharp. Now that the image is sharpened and the contrast has been adjusted, I'm just going to take a look at the original layer so I can get an idea of how we've transformed this image. So we'll look at the original one that came out of Lightroom with the raw adjustments, and now we'll look at the sharp and contrasty result. That's looking pretty good, but I want to take it one step further. Where I've added dynamic contrast now to the whole image, now I want to start adding some dynamic contrast just to the color range. So one more time, I'm going to go up to Filter, Nik Collection, Color Effects Pro, and I'm going to use one more filter to pop those values even more. By default, your last filter will be loaded, so I can go to Contrast Color Range. Just to warn you guys, this one comes with its own custom settings, so you have to zero them out yourself. So just go ahead and zero everything out, and even though brightness is zeroed out, just give it a little wiggle here, and it'll reset it back to nothing, so no effect applied. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to drag this color contrast. What this tries to do is it leaves the luminosity alone. And while it leaves the luminosity alone, it just tries to find areas of contrast, local contrast, in the colors to accentuate it. So right now we have really nice lighting, but very mute conditions. So I'm just going to try to amplify that a little bit more. If I turn it all the way up, you can see that I'm getting really crisp highlights and shadows, but it's too much, stripped it of the color and detail. So really I just want to find a nice happy medium where I can get some of that light from the sun here and still some of those shadows. So pick something a little bit, maybe around 50 or 60%. The next thing I want to do, I'm going to add one more for you guys today, and that's just to get a little bit more blue out of the sky. A lot of people shoot with polarizers, not for any special effects, just simply because they like the polarized look on a sky. It usually ends up being a little bit more of a richer blue, and greens and yellows can pop just a little bit, but it's very subtle. I did not shoot this with a polarizer, so I'm going to add a filter called polarization. Polarization is really simple. You can even rotate it just like you rotate a polarizer. I like to leave it default at 105, and I'm just going to pull the strength up a little bit. And as I pull the strength up a little bit, if I toggle this on and off, you can see that now I'm getting a little bit more of the blues here, becoming more saturated, a little bit darker. And as an effect, I've also gotten more blues in the water, which is nice. So I've reflected those blues and gotten better highlights in the water. I'm going to say, okay. Well, that's looking pretty good. So we've taken it another step and we've added even more contrast just in the colors. But before we go any further, I'm going to go back to Lightroom and I'm going to zero out the adjustments that we made. And I can do that by holding the Option key on the keyboard and clicking where it says Reset Tone. I want to bring this into Photoshop so we can compare our before and after. So I'm going to go ahead and export this, and I'm going to say export with previous this time so it remembers all my settings. And I'm not going to overwrite the file. I'm going to use unique names because I have not saved my PSD yet. I'll explain how to do this in a little while, but right now I'm just going to go ahead and put this into my document, and I'm going to put it behind the background layer. So right now, when you have a background layer and you want to move a layer behind it, it doesn't allow you to do it. So the first thing that you have to do is double click on the layer and just say OK. And that's going to transform it from the background layer just into a regular layer. So I can put this behind. So now it's on the bottom. So I can show you guys the progression of what we've done here. We've started straight out of camera with a single RAW. We've made RAW adjustments in Lightroom. Then we've added contrast using Color Effects Pro, and then we've added color contrast using Color Effects Pro. And lastly, sharpening, which just pops out all the details. So we've been able to go from here to here in a few easy steps. At this point, there are so many other things that we can do to get even more out of this image to make it even more impressive, but I'm going to save some of those tools for future lessons because I want to start slow and I want to build you guys up so that you retain all this information and you can get the same mileage out of your own images. You can even see if I zoom into the sky, you guys can start to see here these spots, and that's sort of a testament to how clean I keep my sensor. There's a lot of little issues, little cleanup things that we need to do, some more dynamic contrast in the foreground, some color stuff. All those things will come later. So this is about as far as I want to take this one. It's already pretty good from here to here, and we'll start getting more advanced, introducing new tools in the next chapter. So that wraps up this post-processing session. It's time to get back into the field.